Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting. Well, I guess you could say we're going to be looking at attractiveness.
Oh, yeah.
More specifically, how the length of your arms and legs plays a role in what we find appealing.
Those limb proportions, huh? They can be surprisingly important, you know?
Oh, I bet. I am definitely intrigued, and I'm sure you are too.
Oh, we're
We are going to be dissecting a research article from the Royal Society Open Science Journal. It's called, get this, The Influence of Leg-to-Body Ratio, Arm-to-Body Ratio, and Intra-Limb Ratio on Male Human Attractiveness.
a real mouthful, huh?
It is. Before we jump into the study itself, can you give us like a quick explanation of LBR, ABR, and IR, just so we're all on the same page?
Absolutely. LBR stands for leg to body ratio, which is basically, the length of your legs compared to your overall height.
Okay, makes sense.
ABR, same idea, but with your arms, arm to body ratio.
Gotcha.
And lastly, we've got IR, or intra-limb ratio, and that one compares the proportions within your limbs, like your thigh to your calf, for example.
Okay, makes sense. So this study, it wasn't the first one to look at these ratios, right?
No.
What did this study do differently?
Right, yeah. So a lot of the earlier studies used like simple line drawings or silhouettes to represent bodies. This study, though, they wanted to, get closer to real world conditions.
Right.
They used these 3D computer generated figures, much more realistic.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So
Yeah.
people aren't stick figures after all.
Exactly.
Okay, so what did they find out about LBR?
Well, the study found that men with legs that were, slightly longer than average, they were rated as the most attractive.
Interesting.
Not like super long, just a little bit above the norm.
So you're telling me my slightly longer legs could be giving me an edge. All right. I like that.
Well, maybe.
But why? Why is that? Why slightly longer legs?
Well, in evolutionary biology, there's this idea of averageness.
Oh.
And average features, they're often seen as signs of genetic diversity, like a good immune system.
So longer legs, they could be signaling good health, strong genes.
That's one theory, yeah. And think about it from a practical standpoint. Longer legs, maybe that means you can run faster, you're more athletic.
That's true. It's amazing how much we can kind of infer, just from leg length.
It is, yeah.
What about legs that are like much shorter or much longer than average? Anything interesting there?
Actually, yeah. They found that when there were these extreme deviations from average LER, so both too short and too long, there were actually some negative health outcomes associated with that.
Huh. So it seems like those slightly longer legs, they're kind of hitting a sweet spot then.
Right, yeah, between health and attractiveness.
Okay, that's really interesting. Let's move on to arm length. Did ABR have a similar impact?
This is where things get a little bit unexpected. Are you ready for this?
Okay.
Arm length had no effect on attractiveness ratings. None at all.
Wait, really? So it doesn't matter if you've got, like, T-Rex arms or arms down to your knees?
It seems that way. The researchers, they offered a couple of possible explanations for this. Maybe it's just that changes in arm length, they're just less noticeable than
Right.
changes in leg length. Or maybe, arm length doesn't vary as much in the population, so those differences just don't stand out.
Okay, yeah, I could see that. It's like the differences just get lost.
Right, exactly.
But wait, I thought arm length was connected to health too.
It is, but the link to fitness, it's just not as strong as it is for leg length. So maybe, ABR just doesn't send that same strong signal about overall health.
Fascinating. So,
Yeah.
at least for this group of people, arm length didn't really matter when they were judging attractiveness. All right, what about IR? How do the proportions within the limbs affect all of this?
Okay, so for IR, they did find a slight preference for average IRs, meaning people tended to rate figures that had more extreme proportions, like,
Yeah.
a really long upper segment or lower segment. They rated those as less attractive.
So that averageness principle, it comes up again.
Exactly. But, and here's the thing, this effect was much weaker than the LBR effect.
Okay.
And when they manipulated IR for just one limb, like just the arm or just the leg, the effect actually disappeared completely.
Oh, wow. So maybe it's like those differences, they only become obvious when both limbs are changing at the same time.
That's possible, yeah. And remember, we're talking about pretty subtle differences here. The human eye can't always catch every little detail.
That's true. Okay, now that we've kind of gone over, the basics of this study, what are some things we should keep in mind when we're trying to understand these results?
Well, all of this research was done with heterosexual women in the United States.
Okay, so We can't just assume that everyone else would have the same preferences.
Exactly. Yeah. Cultural differences could definitely be at play here.
Right.
Also, they use just one base body from their computer software, so that might have, limited the variety of physiques that they could test.
Right. So more research is always a good thing.
Absolutely.
It's pretty amazing, though, to think that something like leg length can have such a big impact on how we see attractiveness.
It really is, yeah. Now imagine you're at a party and you see someone across the room, and they've got these like really long legs. You can't help but notice.
It's true.
Hmm.
And you're right. It is kind of unsettling to think that something so, I don't know, superficial could have this like strong pull on us.
It is, it is. But you got to remember, like we've been talking about, these findings, they're rooted in, evolutionary biology. So like way back when, yeah, it made sense to be drawn to traits that signaled good health, the ability to reproduce.
Right.
But obviously things are a bit different now.
Yeah, we're not in the Stone Age anymore.
Right, exactly. So like those impulses, they don't always, line up with our modern values.
It's like our brains are still kind of playing by these old rules,
Yeah, exactly.
even though the game has totally changed.
Right. So, it's important to remember this research just highlights these like subconscious biases we might have. It doesn't mean we're like controlled by them, though we can be aware of them and, make an effort to challenge them.
So we have the power to choose
Right.
what we value, how we judge people.
Absolutely. And we got to remember attractiveness is subjective. What one person finds attractive, someone else might be like, meh.
Right.
And culture, that plays a huge role too.
It's like that saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Exactly, exactly. And beauty standards, I mean, they change over time, even within the same culture. So yeah, it's important to like, think critically about those like narrow definitions of attractiveness and just celebrate all the different kinds of bodies out there.
I love that. This deep dive has really been like eye-opening.
Yeah, me too.
But it raises even more questions too, right? Like
Yeah.
this study focused on how women perceived men. What about like how men perceive women?
Right. Totally different dynamic. Could be totally different evolutionary pressures at play.
And what about clothes? Fashion. Could those be used to like highlight or downplay those limb proportions we've been talking about?
Ooh, that's a good point. Yeah. Like the fashion industry could be tapping into these preferences without even realizing it.
Right. Like high heels,
Yeah.
they make legs look longer, which could totally play into that whole LBR thing.
Exactly, exactly. And maybe like some styles of clothing, they do the opposite for men, minimizing those features.
It's something to think about, that's for sure.
It is, yeah. So much food for thought.
Yeah. This deep dive has been a wild ride.
It has, it has. We've gone from like, the very basics of attraction to how those subconscious biases could potentially play out in like society at large.
Okay, so what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to walk away with today?
I'd say remember this. Biology, yeah, it definitely plays a role in what we find attractive, but it's not the whole picture. Culture, personal preferences, even trends like fashion, they all play a part too.
Right, so it's a reminder to be aware of those biases and to just appreciate the diversity of, human bodies.
Well said, yeah. And it makes you wonder, if something like leg length can unconsciously influence how attractive we find someone, could it also be affecting other judgments we make, in everyday life?
What do you mean?
Well, like, think about it. Hiring decisions, first impressions, even just how we interact with strangers.
Right.
Are we subconsciously favoring people with certain limb proportions? And if so, like, what does that mean for them? Their opportunities, their experiences.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you're right. It makes you think about all the ways we might be judging people without even realizing it.
Exactly, exactly. It's definitely something to be mindful of. But hey, the good news is, now that we know about these potential biases, we can start to, challenge them.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has. And it leaves us with, I think, a final, thought to ponder.
Lay it on us. What is that final thought?
What? Well, we've been talking about how limb proportions can affect attractiveness ratings.
Right.
But could these, subconscious biases, could they actually have even, deeper implications for, how we perceive and judge people in all sorts of, everyday situations?
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
Yeah, so, think about it. From, job interviews to first dates to just, how we interact with, strangers on the street. Are we like subconsciously, favoring those with certain limb proportions? And if so, like what impact does that have on them? Their opportunities, their experiences.
Whoa, yeah. It makes you wonder, could those unconscious biases be affecting things like, I don't know, who gets hired, who gets asked out on a date, all that stuff?
Exactly, yeah. And even in the fashion industry, are we like, accidentally, I guess, perpetuating these preferences through the clothes we design, the models we choose?
That's a really, really interesting point. This whole conversation has made me realize, like, how much we just take these perceptions of attractiveness for granted.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that something as simple as, leg length can actually have this like, big impact on our subconscious minds.
But hey, at least now that we're aware of it,
Mhm.
now that we know these biases might be there, we can start to challenge them.
Absolutely. Awareness is like, the first step to creating a world that's more inclusive, more equitable, where people are judged on, who they are, what they can do, not on like, how long their legs are.
So well said. This has been an incredible deep dive. We've gone from the science of attraction all the way to like how those subconscious biases might be playing out in our everyday lives.
Oh, it's been a journey for sure. And we've just like, scratched the surface.
So what's the final message for our listeners? Like, what do we want them to take away from this whole conversation?
I'd say stay curious, keep asking questions, and, really be mindful of those subtle ways that our perceptions can influence how we judge others, how we interact with others.
And remember, beauty comes in all shapes and sizes.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining us for another fascinating deep dive. We'll see you next time.